In a pivotal moment for European diplomacy, foreign ministers from Ukraine, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, the UK, the European Union and the US are convening in Paris to address the ongoing Ukraine crisis. The summit aims to forge a unified strategy, balancing military support, sanctions and diplomatic negotiations. As the conflict enters its third year, the international community is seeking pathways to peace, with France playing a central role in coordinating these crucial discussions. What is the significance of the Paris meeting and its role in shaping the EU's stance on the Ukraine crisis? We'll find out. I'm Henny Saif, and this is Think Tank.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
The Guardian has reported that as the Munich Security Conference approaches, Ukraine remains at the forefront of European diplomatic discussions. President Zelensky emphasizes that security guarantees for Ukraine are only viable with continued US involvement, warning that Europe alone cannot fill the gap. Meanwhile, US President Trump has suggested a possible deal to end the war, raising concerns in Kiev about future US support. Zelensky aims to secure American backing for Ukraine's reconstruction, highlighting lucrative investment opportunities, particularly in Ukraine's natural resources, to attract US companies. He also stressed the importance of US military aid, such as Patriot air defense systems, to protect Ukraine. The delicate balance of diplomacy intensifies as Zelensky prepares for meetings in Munich, where he faces both the prospect of peace talks and the uncertainty of continued Western support amid shifting US political dynamics. The Kiev Post has reported that the US Secretary of Defense Peter Hegesth's visit to NATO headquarters highlights Washington's demand for European allies to take greater responsibility for supporting Ukraine and boosting defense spending. Hegesth is set to meet NATO defense ministers in Brussels to discuss these issues. Under President Trump's America First policy, NATO is under pressure to raise its defense spending target from 2% to at least 3% of the GDP. Many European countries have already increased military spending, but Hegesth's visit signals the start of renewed discussions on defense commitments. The war in Ukraine remains central, with the US urging Europe to own this conflict, moving forward, calling for more European contributions to Ukraine's defense efforts as NATO increases its pressure. The Paris summit, bringing together key global players, will shape the future of the Ukraine crisis, European security and the international response to the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
The Paris summit, bringing together the foreign ministers of Ukraine, the UK, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, the EU and the US, marks a pivotal moment in the Ukrainian crisis, shaping both European security and global geopolitics. Hosted by France, a key diplomatic player, the summit underscored its role as a mediator, advocating for EU unity and diplomatic solutions to the conflict. The primary objective is to solidify international support for Ukraine and ensure a cohesive EU stance on military aid, sanctions, and diplomacy. The European Parliament has reaffirmed its commitment to Ukraine, emphasizing sustained financial and military assistance alongside sanctions targeting Russia's economy. A key focus is evaluating the effectiveness of sanctions and strengthening the EU's defense capabilities to increase pressure to end the conflict. The US, having provided $69.2 billion in military aid to Ukraine, plays a central role in shaping the EU's strategic approach. NATO's involvement is also critical, as discussions center on reinforcing the alliance's collective defense commitments. While military aid remains priority, the summit also explores diplomatic avenues to de-escalate the conflict and work toward a peaceful resolution. France's leadership in this effort highlights its ambition to steer EU policy, balancing support for Kyiv and long-term stability in the region. Ultimately, the Paris summit presents an opportunity to reshape Europe's and the world's response to the Ukrainian crisis, carrying significant implications for security and diplomacy.
And to delve deeper into the most recent updates concerning the most recent updates of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we are joined from Kiev by Mr. Oleksiy Melnyk, a former Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister and the co-director of the Foreign Relations and International Security Programs in Razumikov Center. And from Moscow, we're joined by Mr. Sergei Markov, the former advisor to President Vladimir Putin. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here on Think Tank. Mr. Melnyk, my first question goes to you. Now, with the US urging Europe to own the conflict moving forward, how will this pressure influence the European Union's cohesion in its military and diplomatic support for Ukraine?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. First of all, let me correct one of the statements you made several times in the introduction, calling Russian-Ukrainian war as a Ukrainian crisis. I think it's a very wrong definition, because actually we should talk about the Russian crisis. The Russian-Ukrainian war is because the Russian aggressive neo-colonialist, neo-imperial policy. And if you agree with me, then the problem is to be solved is the current Russian policy. And that's why there is a huge concern in Europe, NATO, and globally, because if Russia is not stopped here in Ukraine, then realistically, there is a perspectives of war, of Russian attack against other European countries, against other neighbors of Russia, like Baltic states or Poland. And that's why I think that it's not just Ukrainian business to get security guarantees. This is what Ukrainian leaders, NATO leaders, American leaders should think about guarantees against future aggression of Russia. And that's why I think that they shouldn't just listen what Ukraine requests. They should think, first of all, about stability, regional and global stability and security.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Markov, do you also share the idea that it is Russia's problem that needs to be solved now, with Europe attempting to mobilize the further support for Ukraine amid the US reluctance? Will this hamper the Trump administration's efforts to reach a deal with Russia regarding the cessation of hostilities in Ukraine?
As I understand, and I work for American organizations more than 10 years, understand most of the American people don't understand what is a war for. And Americans believe that it's not war between Russia and Ukraine, but it's a proxy war between Russia and United States. And it's very risky by nuclear war and nuclear catastrophe generally. That's why most of the American people demand from American President Donald Trump to stop this war, and at minimum to stop United States involvement in such a war for the personal security reason from any nuclear catastrophe. And it will be mostly a possible decision of Donald Trump to suggest some compromise. And it's plan A. And I expect that both sides, Russia and Ukraine, will deny this Donald Trump's suggestion. And also Europe will block this moving to the peace, because most of the European leaders support continuing of such war against Russia on Ukrainian territory. And as a result, it will be Plan B by Donald Trump. It's meaning that United States, which spending approximately $300 billion for Ukrainian army, will cut this spending maybe 3 times, and 100 will be on the as burden on the budget of European countries, and maybe 100 billions will be just not paid to the Ukrainian army. And then the war will continue. And to the end of this war, when Ukrainian regime will get a lot of problems because of cutting of military support, and because European countries also will have a lot of problems because they will have to almost to double their financial spending to Ukrainian war with clear no positive results, it will be political conditions for the peaceful resolving such conflict, meaning to the end of this war and to the end of this year. As I understand, this is exactly a pragmatic plan of the Donald Trump. Donald Trump talking about a peace deal on Ukraine during 100 days, but I think he understands that it's impossible, and he will allow things to go forward for the formation of the political conditions for the peace deal. But for the peace deal, most important that the reason of this crisis should be resolved. Main reason of this crisis is repressive Ukrainian regime, which use terror against own citizens and against Russia and against those Ukrainian regions and Ukrainian people who left this very dangerous space, which Ukraine is under the power of repressive regime. So this problem should be resolved.
Mr. Milnik, yes. I'm sorry, but Mr. Milnik, Dr. Markov has actually anticipated a refusal by both sides, Russia and Ukraine, towards the American proposal. But before we start talking about that, what key points do you think will be critical for Ukraine's representatives to push for at the Paris summit, especially in terms of military aid and international support?
There are some red lines for Ukraine, and I think what is the main probably message that our officials should communicate to our Western partners, that Ukraine, which Russia and our guest from Moscow calls many times as Kiev regime, Ukraine is a democratic country. And even if President Trump can persuade our President Zelensky to accept some very painful concessions and compromises, it doesn't automatically mean that Ukrainian society, Ukrainian defense forces will accept this. And I don't know what kind of consequences, what kind of reactions would be from Ukrainian society. And that's why Ukrainian president is quite limited in his freedom of maneuver. And the red lines that I'm talking about is, first of all, the territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ukraine and Ukrainian leader actually announced our readiness to not to fight militarily to liberate the whole territory of Ukraine, but is not ready to accept Russian right to annex these territories. So there is a compromise that there could be political diplomatic solution for the occupied Ukrainian territories. Another red line is security guarantees that Russia, after a ceasefire, will not attack Ukraine in a matter of months or couple of years. And that's what actually, there are two main points and two main objectives that Ukraine will try to achieve in consultations with our partners and during the future negotiations.
Dr. Markov, do you think that the suggestions from Ukraine that Mr. Milnik has actually mentioned, do you think that they are feasible outcomes, that both countries, Ukraine and Russia, can work this out? I mean, what potential outcomes do you anticipate from the Paris summit? Will it encourage peace efforts or further reinforce the military aid to Ukraine and sanctions against Russia? You've mentioned the possibility of the war continuing and going on. What is a more feasible and realistic outcome of such a summit?
I think that the main result of Trump-Putin summit or Paris summit now?
The Paris summit.
Paris summit. Paris summit, I think, will have only result some kind of consolidation of European countries around Kyiv repressive regime and around ideas that a war shouldn't be stopped and war should be continued. I think most European countries agree with this. They have some kind of hopes that they will have a strategic defeat to Russia. I think it's a very big mistake of them. And Napoleon Bonaparte in 19th century and Adolf Hitler in 20th century already made such a mistake. And I recommend Europe not to repeat mistakes of Napoleon and Hitler. And about a specific result, Russia have very strong demands. The main result of reason of Russia is to have conditions which can protect from a new war. If we will have Ukraine, which will be with this repressive Russophobic regime, which prohibits the Russian language and Orthodox Church, with a lot of weaponry, with propaganda that Russia is an enemy of Ukraine and Russia occupy Ukrainian territory, and everybody understands that this make next war inevitable in 2 or 3 years. That's why those reasons for new war should be resolved. Russia suggests very easily. First of all, demilitarization of Ukraine, meaning limitations of some weaponry. And most important is denazification of Ukraine. It's meaning disbanding, stopping of current repressive Russophobic regime. Neutrality of Ukraine, also not membership in NATO. More or less, Western countries agree with 20% of Russian demands, but it's absolutely not enough. It's not Russian victory, I would say. Russian victory if Kharkov, Odessa, Dnipro, Kyiv, and all most of those regions will be part of the Russia, and if all Ukrainian leaders will be arrested, and there will be some kind of Nuremberg International Tribunal against them. But this is what Russia wants. But Russia understands it's not realistic, but a more realistic compromise. Demilitarization, denazification, and now Western countries and Paris summit will show this, not ready to accept this, but after another maybe 6 or 8 months of fighting, I think political conditions will be enough for the Western countries to agree with these Russian conditions.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Milnik, do you see or do you think that these scenarios that Dr. Markov has actually mentioned, are they even on the table for Ukraine? How do you think the dynamics between the European Union and the US will be changing or shifting in terms of the Paris summit that is going to be taking place? Do you feel that things are moving in the right direction for Ukraine?
Thank you for your question. Let me first respond to some of the statements made by Dr. Markov. I think he's supposed to know that the gravest international crime is the crime of military aggression. And this is not Ukraine that attacked Russia. This is Russia that attacked Ukraine and occupied Ukrainian territory. And that's why it's ridiculous talking or listen to him that Ukraine needs to be punished for simply executing its right for self-defense. And if we talk about the possible outcomes of the Paris summit, the level of the Paris summit is actually not the level of decision makers. That's mostly about consultations. And what we expect for the Paris summit, because in addition to European ministers, there will be representative of the new American administration. And that's the first this kind of meeting where I think European partners and American partners with the president of Ukrainian minister are supposed to reach a common ground, a common position for the future negotiations with which is supposed to take place between President Trump and President Putin, because there must be consolidated position, there must be clear understanding of the division of responsibilities, division of burden between American and European partners. And that's what I expect from the outcomes from the meeting.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Markov, now, if such a summit is basically for consultation, or maybe it would foreshadow the decision makers' plan, do you think that Russia and Ukraine are committed to reaching a peace deal in the short term, or are they more interested in attempting to achieve their strategic objectives by military means?
I think it's both ways not realistic. Mostly realistic is that Russia will continue its military pressure, and the burden of the losing of lives in Ukraine and the burden of losing of money for Europe will be too big to the end of this year, and they will be agreed to come to compromise. I, by the way, agree with that idea that Ukraine should have a security guarantee. But security guarantee for Ukraine should be not militarization, of course, not continuation of the neo-Nazi regime. Security guarantee should be Ukraine for coming back to the situation before the neo-Nazi coup of 2014. Look, Ukraine as independent country from 1991 until 2014 have been absolutely in safe situation neighboring to the Russia. So situation should be back to the Ukraine before 2014. It means that the main reason of the conflict, repressive neo-Nazi terroristic regime in Ukraine, should be dismantled. As soon European leaders agree, not even orally, but not publicly, but even unpublicly, that this regime in Ukraine should be changed, there is the realistic background for such kind of peace compromise will be reached. By the way, very interesting that today Paris summit, exactly in the 10 days anniversary of Minsk agreement. Minsk agreement was agreement to stop the war, but this Minsk agreement was sharply violated by Ukrainian regime with support of the French and Germany. So France, Germany, they share responsibility for such bloody war with this Ukrainian regime. And these aggressors, these countries who is responsible for such war, now coming together to see how they can stop peace plan of Trump.
Dr. Markov, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are running out of time. Mr. Milnik, one final question for you, and please make it quick and short. Now, will the Trump administration be an agent of consensus or division in the Paris conference? In other words, could the US obstruct further military and financial support to Ukraine in favor of pushing for a quick settlement of the conflict, or not necessarily in Ukraine's favor?
President Trump expressed his interest in ending the war as soon as possible. But as we all know, the United States of America is the biggest power in the world nowadays, but its power also not unlimited. And that's why I think if European leaders will persuade their American counterpart that America needs Europe as much as Europe needs America, then we can hope for a more constructive approach of the new American administration of settling this conflict.
Yes. So, yes or no, do you think it will be in Ukraine's favor or not?
I think it must be in Ukraine's favor, but not probably all the expectations of Ukrainian people will be met. And we should be
Yes.
realistic about our expectations about the possibilities.
Mr. Oleksiy Milnik, the former Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister, and Dr. Sergei Markov, the former advisor to President Vladimir Putin. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here on Think Tank. As the Paris summit unfolds, the world watches closely. Will Europe's diplomatic unity hold? The path forward for Ukraine and European security hinges on the summit's delicate balancing act. That's all the time we have for this episode of Think Tank. I'm Henny Safe. Thank you for joining us.